Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. And what you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's February 23rd. It's also the 23rd day of the trial. It's also the year 2023. And what happens today? Alec Murdaugh takes the stand. Didn't have that on my Murdaugh trial bingo card the first day I walked in that courtroom, but here we are. Wow, what a day so far. And yeah, we'll pick back up on Cross in the morning. We're going to get into it. But first, big thank you to some very special people, Kay and Larry and Teresa, for your donations. Really quick music fact, because we got a lot to get through. This blew my mind, y'all. Creedence Clearwater Revival never had a #1 hit. How did that not happen? Really, they had some great songs. All right, we're jumping in. So, really quick, first witness was Nolan Tootin. We've heard that name several times throughout this trial. Very close friend of Paul's. And before he took the stand, there was just some arguments about the testimony. Again, should Alec take the stand? And essentially, Judge Newman says that, I mean, he's exposing himself to cross-exam if he takes the stand. And he said he can only advise Alec of his rights. That's all he can do. And then they can object as cross-exam progresses. But first, Nolan Tootin was up. Friend of Paul and Buster. He's known the Murdaughs his entire life, pretty much. He said Paul was like a little brother to him and one of his best friends. Paul would call all day, and he was the type of friend that would do anything for his friends. He thought the Murdaughs had good family relationships with each other. And he said Maggie was a sweet woman and loved him like one of her own. So the day of the murders, he went by Moselle in the morning before he went to work. He had talked to Paul on the phone about sunflowers, and they had planned to replant them that very afternoon. But Nolan got caught up at work and was unable to make it to Moselle to do that with Paul. Paul was actually in Okatee that morning, and when Nolan heard about the murders, he went to Moselle. So he doesn't live but about 25 minutes away. So when he got there, he went in through the kennel entrance and he was stopped. And they told him that he had to go through that main entrance. He said Alec was distraught. He hugged him. Alec cried and said they're gone. So it's just really quick. On Cross, they were as close as they could be. Paul was the kind of guy, flat tire on the side of the road at 2 a.m, call him, he would be there. Talks about Paul being responsive with the cell phone. And then he was with Paul the night the 300 blackout was stolen. Apparently, it wasn't misplaced. And he thought that happened back in 2017. So what did Paul do? He took his brother's blackout as his own. He said when he was at Moselle, they would spend a lot of time in that kennel area. And Paul's lifestyle, as we've heard, was unpredictable. He kept clothes all over the state at different people's houses. He was just all over, didn't know where he was going to be at any given time. So the day of the murders, he talked to Paul that morning and in the afternoon. So he decided, along with Paul, that the sunflowers were just a lost cause and they would need to till that field and then just start over and replant. So he got a Snapchat from Paul around 7, and it was a video where some farm equipment was leaking that Paul was showing him. He was able to identify those voices on the kennel video. Everybody's identified those voices, and now Alec admitted to that on the stand today that he lied. So you think about this poor kid. He drives up. He saw the bodies covered with sheets. You think about the range of people that are going to be affected for life. Start way back before we even know. But then really the boat crash. Look at Mallory's life is gone. Then you've got all of her family and friends that are affected. Everybody on that boat will be affected for the rest of their lives due to the event that happened that night. Then the financial crimes. You've got so many people affected by his lying and stealing. And then with the murders, just friends of the family. You've heard from the law partners who are still just devastated that Paul and Maggie were murdered. It's just such a far-reaching case that comes down to one man. And it's just amazing how one person can wreak havoc on other people's lives. But ultimately, they asked him who all was there. Alec, Randy, Ronnie Crosby, Mark Bell. That's who he could remember when he got there. People came afterwards, though. And then Alec that night said the boat wreck. And he asked Nolan to get in touch with Rogan for him. So on redirect, if you're at the house, can you see details at the kennels? He said you can only see the light and the roof. So the moment comes. Alec Murdaugh takes the stand. It was funny to watch the jury's reaction to him being called up because they did some things outside the presence of the jury, but it was one of those where they all shifted in their seat and you could tell they wanted to kind of turn and talk to their person beside him about, oh my gosh, he's getting on the stand, but they can't. They held their composure and were very attentive for the most part throughout his testimony. So I'll say this, it's not lost on me that Alec's a lawyer or was a lawyer. And he has two very good defense attorneys. Say what you will. I know by default, most trial watchers don't like the defense, but they're very good at what they do, as is the prosecution. And so I have a feeling they've known for a very long time this has to happen because number one, he has nothing to lose. He's going to prison for the rest of his life. He doesn't want to be known as somebody who murdered his wife and son. So, with the lies that he's told, there was really no other way around it but to get on that stand. Otherwise, the prosecution would have eaten this for breakfast on closings, pointing out these lies that went unanswered. It had to happen. So, a couple of things people have asked me, what did you think overall about the jury's reaction? They were intrigued at times. They watched him very, very closely. However, and don't get me wrong, I love the prosecution. Creighton Waters is so passionate about this case. And I think the entire team has really done the best job they could do with what they've had to work with. I think it's been difficult at times. This is a circumstantial case, but circumstantial cases get convictions all the time. This is no exception, and it could very well happen. I think that the financial crimes are really starting to wear on this jury, though. They were attentive throughout direct and cross. Towards the end, after lunch, you start to see a few of the jurors really start to lose their focus. And it was very apparent. I mean, it just everybody who was in there saw it. I had the pleasure of seeing an old friend from high school. Her name's Jennifer and her son Jack, who were down here today. They came on like the best day ever to come to the trial. I mean, I told her, buy a lottery ticket on your way home, girl, because you hit it today if you wanted to come see some excitement in the courtroom. But everybody in that courtroom watched that jury, and a lot of people really did notice that we had a couple that really kind of dropped off the map towards the end, looked bored, looked really just ready for the financials to be over. And every time the financials were mentioned, you could just see some of the a few of the jurors. I don't want to say even it wasn't even half, but there were a few that had visible reactions of just, can we please move on? And I get it. It's no secret the man lied. It's no secret the man stole from very, very vulnerable people who were nobody's deserving to be stolen from in that situation when you're suing somebody because you've been injured. We all know that. It's been talked about and talked about and talked about. And I understand that what the state's trying to do is to push onto the jury that this man has no moral compass. He has essentially no feelings towards what his actions to others do. It's all very selfish. I think that you've got to understand from a juror, from somebody who's just sitting in that seat as a common person who doesn't know the lay of law, who doesn't know the ins and outs of things. I think it's got to come back to the murders tomorrow to really drive home and reiterate this trial isn't about the financials, it's about Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. That's just my opinion. I've said it over and over and over. This is an amazing journey with everybody in this courtroom. We have bonded. I've made such great friends, and I'm sure that jury has bonded. I'm also sure that jury wants to get back to real life. So I think hopefully tomorrow lay off the financials. Now, Creighton Waters did say another 3 to 4 hours on cross. So that is lengthy. And then you got redirect. So, and then you got who knows? I think he'll be on the stand all day tomorrow. The defense did ask at the end of the day today if they could call a couple of witnesses that shouldn't take but a couple of hours total first, because I guess of some travel plans. And the prosecutor said, no, I don't want to mess up the flow of my cross exam. I don't know if he used the exact words, but in other words, no, we're going to keep crossing tomorrow. So he'll be back on the stand first thing, it seems, unless there's a change of heart overnight. So what did Alec do? First thing, he says good morning to the jury. And I will say that he kept eye contact with that jury a lot, and they with him. There were very few that didn't make eye contact with him for extended amounts of time. They were listening to him. So on June 7th, I mean, Jim Griffin doesn't mince words. Did you take this gun and shoot your son? Alex says, no, I did not. I don't know verbatim if he said, no, I did not. But did you take this gun or one like it and blow his brains out? No. Did you shoot a 300 blackout in Maggie's head? I did not shoot my wife or son ever. Was that you on the kennel video? It is. Were you at the kennels? I was. Did you lie to deputies? Yes. Did you lie again on June 10th? I did lie. June 11th, did you lie again? Yes. Why did you lie? He said as his addiction evolved, he would get paranoid. And it could be anything from a look somebody gave him to a reaction somebody had to something, or just a police car behind him as he's driving down the road. He said after finding Maggie and Paul, his intuition was don't talk to anybody. And all of his law partners told him that. He talks about them taking the gunshot residue from his hands in the car. They asked him about his relationships with Maggie and Paul. And he said, with my paranoid thoughts on June 7th, I wasn't thinking clearly and I lied about being there. He said, I'm sorry I did. He apologized to Buster, Grandma and Papa T, both of our families, most of all, sorry to Mags and Paul Paul. He called Paul the whole time of his testimony today. He said, I'd never do anything intentionally to hurt them, ever, ever. So he talks about the continued lying. And he said, oh, what a tangled web we weave. He said, once I told my family, I had to keep lying. So June 7th, what happened? He said he had been at work. It was a normal day. Maggie was going to the doctor. She had stuff to do down in Edisto. And he said he always asked Maggie to come stay with him at Moselle. So a lot of people, then he says a lot of people call Paul Paw. Alec knew about the sunflowers, and Paul had told him that they had been sprayed and they were dead. So he said the dove field, which is where these sunflowers were planted, they attract doves, and then hunters take the doves out of the sky. He said it was a social parlor on that land, must be where everybody gathered and talked dove. He said it was a big deal, and he knew in the morning that Paul was going to be there at Moselle later that night, by the way. So when they go right around, at first they go to the dove field. So they get there, and you could tell the sunflowers were dead, and they knew the only option was going to be to replant these flowers. So he said they spent time together, rode around, went to the different food plots that they had planted. They went across the road. They went to the deer stands. They went to the duck pond. And he specifically remembers the duck pond because he had helped Paul plant corn in the dove field. And so Paul planted corn at the duck pond himself, and he was rubbing it into Alec's face that his were doing better than his dad's. He talks about the cabin on the property. It seems they went there. It's a 4-room residence. There's a living area, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom. He said they went to the shop, and he said the shop on the property was the hub. There was something always going on in the shop. He said that there are just tools in there. It's your typical workshop. He said they unloaded a bulldozer. Then they asked him about the Snapchat video that was made the night of the murders where Alec's pushing down that tree and he's in the blue shirt. So he calls it the sawtooth oaks. When they were riding around the food plot, they saw these oaks. And he said the plots are not as long as a field, but you plant vegetation to attract animals there. He said, I'm fooling with a fruit tree I've been working on for years and it wouldn't stand straight. So then he talks about Paul. He said you couldn't be around Paul and not have a good time. He said they couldn't have been any closer, and he was wonderful. And he loved doing anything with Paul because he was a delight. His passion was Moselle. He loved to work the fields, the food plots, just anything hands on. He said, then they're asked about what time Paul got there, and Alex said that now that he's seen all of these records that we've heard about here at trial, he realizes that Paul actually got home after he did, and Maggie got there after 8. He was at the shop when she came. So he said if Blanca had gotten the mail, she might not stop by the kennels, but it's not unusual for her to stop by there if she's been out of town at Edisto. He left Paul at the shop and then he went to the house. While he was there, that's when he met up with Maggie. So he talked about the clothes in that snap. It kind of jumps around a little bit, but we're just going to read it like it was in court today. He talks about being 6'4" and 265 pounds on June 7th. He talks about that. So he says he got sweaty. They had cleaned the bulldozer. He said, I'm heavy, taking Oxycontin, which makes you sweat. So he changed into the clothes that we saw on the body cam video after that shower, which was the shorts and the t-shirt. So Blanca cooked and Maggie fixed their plate. And he said at that point, when she had fixed the plate and he was done with the shower, Paul was actually almost done eating by the time he got out and was ready to eat. He said it's not unusual. Paul is always on the go, never sits still. And usually they eat in that living room, in the couch, on the couch in front of the TV. Paul usually eats in the recliner, putting his plate on the ottoman. He said if anybody was in that house, the TV was always on. So he thought that Paul had moved on to do something else, but he said again, after seeing the records, he realized Paul stayed around the house after he ate for a little while. So Maggie wanted to go to the kennels, and Alex said he laid on the couch. Maggie asked him to go, but he said, I had just showered. It's hot. I'd need another shower if I went down there. Also, when you let the dogs out, it gets a little wild, apparently. So they go back to June 4th. Alex's dad's in the hospital in Savannah. He said he went to visit that afternoon, ended up spending the night. He mentions a really nice nurse got him a soft chair. And when asked if he slept, he said, I'm sure I slept. So that's June 4th. So that next day, the Saturday, that's when they go meet Brooklyn and Buster up in Columbia for that regional baseball tournament the Gamecocks had. They stayed in Columbia that night and went and tailgated early. Maggie had actually reconnected with a college friend whose son played for the Gamecocks, so he was talking about how fun that was. It was a night game, and so when it was over, they went back to the hotel. On the next day, there's another game. They ended up and got back to Moselle. He was with Maggie, and they talk about Maggie bringing the donuts to Randolph, saying that she loved Randolph. And Maggie stayed at Moselle that night. So the day of the murders, it was a work day. Maggie left and he thinks she rode with Paul. So Alex stayed in the house and he talks. Then they go back to the night at the kennels. And then they're talking about when Maggie asked him to go down to the kennels with her after dinner. He didn't want to. He didn't want to get sweaty, laid on the couch. He said he changed his mind and he got on the golf cart and rode down to the kennels. He said the golf cart, by the way, stays by the house most of the time. It's just where it stays. I think it was to the left of the house. He said it was chaos at the kennels. Maggie had let the dogs out. And Grady and Bubba, it seems to be those were kind of their two family dogs. It seems like maybe the other dogs are just bird dogs that they go get when they want to go hunt. And he said that Maggie had a really special place in her heart for Bubba, which was Paul's dog. And he talks about if you look at the behind the kennels, there's those pine trees. In fact, we just heard testimony the other day about how there was a defect in that pine tree. The dogs would run, and he said Bubba would have to mark every single tree. So when Alec got to the kennels, the dogs were still, I guess, marking their spot. So he said that Grady was chasing guineas, and he explains that guineas are like chickens, but they make a lot of racket. He said they're like a guard bird, and anything disturbs them, whether it's people or a noise. He said Grady's chasing them, and Paul's fooling around with Cash, which is Rogan's dog, and Maggie was just watching the dogs play when he got down to the kennels. He said Bubba didn't chase to kill. It was about the chase, and whenever he would catch one, he was proud and he would prance around. He said most of the time these chickens or guineas weren't dead. They kind of go into like a fake death mode where they're lethargic. So he said you got to put the chicken by itself and let him do what a chicken does. And I will say that some people in the jury, as well as people in just the main seating area, got a chuckle. So he knew that Paul was helping Rogan with cash. And he said at that point, Maggie was standing back near the feed room in the driveway. And Paul at that point still messing around with Cash the dog. They talk about tracking collars for the dogs. He said Bubba had his tracking collar on and that Paul had a series of tracking collars for these dogs to tell where they were. I guess sometimes they can run off and you don't know where they are. So you can track them up to a certain point, then it stops. He said that Bubba was bad about taking off, especially with Maggie. He would take off when she would let him out. And so they left and went back to the house. He left and went back to the house on the golf cart. Then he's asked about that water hose. He didn't notice it. Then they go back to talking about Bubba. He said Bubba always listened to him, and it didn't take long to get the chicken. He said Bubba was proud and wanted to show me what he had caught. He said ultimately he wanted to get back to the house in the air condition, and that's when he laid on the couch. The TV was on. Maybe he dozed, maybe he didn't, but he got up and decided to go visit his mom. Then he talks about how he typically talks to Barbara Mixon most every day. Now, we know that yesterday when Miss Mixon testified, they did show the call to Alec right before 4 p.m., where, according to Miss Mixon, she had said that he needed to come check on his mom because she was agitated. And then Alec on the stand today explains that Miss Libby would get agitated when Randolph would go to the hospital. So he was sick for a couple of years and it was in and out of the hospital a lot over those couple of years. And she just sensed when he wasn't there because she would get agitated. She would cry. She would fuss. And he said, I know Alzheimer's patients are unpredictable, but she was just agitated when he was not there. So Miss Mixon gave Miss Libby her medication, told him there's no urgency. And he adds in there that Libby loves Miss Mixon. And he also tells a little story of when Miss Libby would fuss at the kids, meaning Alec and his siblings. Miss Mixon could calm her down and she would let up on them. All the siblings were shaking their head yes, by the way, and they were smiling. By the way, siblings, people have asked me, what were his siblings doing today? What was Buster doing? It was a lot of mixed emotions. There were times where I think there was some embarrassment amongst the family. It's got to be really hard to sit there and hear your brother, your father, your uncle confess to stealing from very vulnerable people. There was a lot of sadness. I think that hearing this recollection of it was hard for them. They lost 2 people in their family that night, really 3. They'll never have Alec back. I mean, that's it, nor should they with everything he's been accused of. And but still, there's a weight there, I think, and it was obvious today at times. So that was kind of my take on it, at least. They just sit and watch, really, though. But you do see emotion come out. So they go through and show a series of pictures of Alameda, which is his mom's house, essentially just clearing up where everybody parked when they went there. We know that document that they showed the jury and us has that tree line with the red dots that go right up against that tree line. But then the picture, you see that where everybody parked in the back was kind of around a tree line. He said that his dad was usually in the breakfast room. He had a recliner and a TV there. If he wasn't in that breakfast room, he was on the back deck. Miss Libby, in her better days, would be in her bedroom, the kitchen, or the breakfast room. So the night of the murders, June 7th, Miss Libby and Shelley were there and he knocked on the door, which we know Shelley didn't hear. So he called his mom's landline and visited with his mom. So he explained in her bedroom, she has her regular bed, which is like a 4-poster bed. And then to the left, she had a hospital bed that's what she was staying in at this point. And there is a TV and a recliner in there, mainly for the caregiver. So he sat on her bed and talked to her. He said his mom was awake. He held her hand. And even though her condition wasn't good, she seemed to be doing pretty well. And at that point, she was not agitated. So he just talked to her. He said he really tried to always be positive and upbeat with her and just to make sure she was okay. He said, "I stayed for a few minutes. She looked tired." He said he got up and sat on I'm guessing her regular bed, her four-poster bed, and laid down. He said he talked to Shelly and they watched TV. He said Maggie wasn't planning to go with him to his mom's that night. She didn't like to visit Miss Libby just because it made her sad, and I understand that. Alex said his mom was a shell of her old self, so that makes people sad, and I get it. He said she loved visiting Mr. Randolph, and so they go back to when he left to go to his mom's. Why not go by the kennels? He said at that point there was really no reason to go by the kennels. He said, I was going to Alameda. He tried to call Maggie, no answer, tried again, no answer, texted her. He said when she didn't answer, he wasn't worried because she was with Paul. And then he stops and starts to cry. He said it's not unusual to not get them on the phone with the cell service out there. So driving back to Moselle, they talk about the data. You stopped in the driveway for a minute. He said he was getting his phone. It had fallen down between the center console and the seat, and it was just hard to get to. Then Jim Griffin comes in. Did you dispose of your gun or clothes in that time? No. They talk about him driving faster on the ride back. Alex said it was kind of just the normal way he drove. So back at Moselle, he went through that main gate to get to the house and saw the lights were on inside the main residence. Paul and Maggie, however, as we know, were not there. He said he was inside a few minutes and he wasn't surprised that they weren't there, but really kind of thought they would be back at this point. He talks about how he was hot natured. Maggie, on the other hand, always cold. So she would usually watch TV in the hunting room because it had a separate thermostat. So he went to see if she was in there and she wasn't. She also liked to take baths, went in there, she wasn't there, and then he assumed they were still at the kennels. What does he do? Drove to the kennels. And he said, I saw what y'all saw. It was so bad. He said he saw them on the ground when he pulled up and he jumped out of his car. He said, I'm not exactly sure, ran back to my car, called 911. While he was on the phone, he said he was trying to tend to Maggie, back and forth between Maggie and Paul. He said when he got up to Paul, he said it was so bad. He's sobbing at this point. And he said at some point I checked for a pulse. Then he said he tried to turn him over. Well, Jim Griffin says, why? He said, I don't know why. My boy's laying face down, done the way he was done, head gone, his brain's on the sidewalk. He said, I grabbed him by the belt loop to turn him over. And then that's when the phone rolled out. And he said, how? Jim Griffin's like, how? He said it just came out of his pocket and was right beside him. He said he wasn't able to turn Paul. And then when asked on what side of Paul were you, he said he was on the side that the Suburban was on. So we can pull that up. I don't have it here on the computer, but I'd like to look and see exactly where he's talking about. He went to Maggie. He touched her. He doesn't know where. He thinks maybe in the waist area. At this point, the family's emotional. And I have this in my notes that the family was showing a lot of emotion during all this. He said he just went back and forth between the two of them. At this point, they play the 911 call that was made by Alec to Colleton County. And he said, I know I got out of the car. He said, I knew at first, I don't think I went all the way to them and called 911. Then I went to them. They asked, did they shoot themselves? And he said, oh no, hell no. He said he shot really bad. He's got blood everywhere. I can see his brain. Well, my wife has a hole in her head. And then you hear him say the word here. So Jim Griffin says, you say the word here. Alex said, I was talking to dispatch. One of the first things she asked was, did they shoot themselves? I knew no way, there's no gun. So she asked another question. You hear me say here, then I say, if that's what you're asking. It was confusing to me. I don't know. He said there's no dogs out there because the dogs were in the kennels. So he's asked, did you roll the hose up? And he said, no. Did you do anything? He said, I was just trying to find a flashlight and a gun. He said he should have known. And he's asked what he meant. He was referring to the threats that Paul got. He said they didn't take them seriously. I should have known. He said the threats were vile. A lot of them came from social media and they were so over the top that they didn't really think anything about it, didn't take them serious. So he said, we just disregarded it. The last time he talked to Maggie on the call, he said an hour and a half. Then it was 2 hours ago. Then he's asked the last time he saw them by Jim Griffin, took the chicken from Bubba. Jim Griffin asked, "That's the 844 video?" He says, "That's right." What is it with Southern guys? You ask them a question. That's right. That's right. It's that's right. That's what they do. So they asked the last time that he had talked to her in person. Please hurry. Neither one of them's moving. So at this point, he went to the house to get the gun and they bring it out. They asks what he loaded it with. He said he got it off the pool table and it would have been the first place he went to get a gun. He said he grabbed a handful of shells and there was a 16 gauge shell in there. He said, I didn't realize what I was doing. He said, I've hunted all my life, never done that before. And so when he went to get the gun, he didn't know if someone was still out there. That was the reason. So Dennis brought up, you said you're 100 yards from your house is further. He said, I said 100 yards. I was wrong. So they go back to the 911 call. Are they close, ma'am? And then they ask if he had touched them. And he said he had at that time. He said he touched Maggie during the 911 call and then Paul before he made the call. And you said Paul reported threats. Well, he didn't report them to the sheriff's office, apparently, from what I understood, but he did make a report on campus at college. He was asked to meet with the dean of students. Alec appreciated them reaching out to Paul, but he really wanted to get Jim Griffin's opinion about whether or not Paul should talk to them. But really, all it was, they wanted to be sure he was okay. And they were aware of the threats. So they go back to that 911 call. I need to call some of my family. He said he called his brothers, John Marvin, Randy. He called Rogan, who he calls Roro. Why? He said Rogan's house was as the crow flies. He says this, and we say this here in the South. That's your direct point from A to B, as the crow flies. How long does it take me to get to Greenville? As the crow flies, a little under 3 hours. He said it's about 2.5 miles where Rogan lives to Moselle. And he said Rogan's like family and he's the closest person and he wanted somebody to be with him. So then we move on to some of the calls or some of the things that was done on his phone as he's standing there. So some of them are FaceTimes, and he said they're not for me. I might have hit FaceTime on accident, but I don't FaceTime. And then at 10:22, that's when you get the group text from Michael Gunn. She brought the heat from Miami boys. And he said, I can promise you I wasn't reading any texts. Then he's asked about the Safari search at 10:40 for Whaley's and Edisto. Whaley's is really good, by the way, y'all. He said he didn't do that. He said he said that in the past they had gotten takeout from there and it was probably in the search history and he just hit it with his finger. He actually said too that somebody who's not even a personal friend of his, a videographer, is somebody that was called. He said, I'm certainly not calling him. It was unintentional. He's asked about when he went to the bodies, did he get blood on him? And he said he got blood on his fingertips. And then he's asked about the blood and steering wheel. He said, if I got blood on my fingertips, it would have been from touching Maggie. And then he's asked about Maggie's blood being found on the gun. He said, I would have been the one to transfer that there because he said, other than just putting them up, she really didn't handle the guns. They talk about the gunshot residue. His clothes are taken. And he says he handled that shotgun. And he said he had it with him. He was holding it until he put it against the car. So that's his excuse for having gunshot residue on him. They talk about Paul being meticulous about cleaning his gun. He said he was not meticulous about actually doing it, but when he did, he was meticulous. So he didn't do it often, but when he did it right. So they talk about the t-shirt and the high velocity spatter. He said there's no way I had high velocity blood spatter on me. He said, I've seen the reports. Were you in the vicinity? Nope. He asked, was there anywhere that you changed? And he said, no. He said, I had on the shorts and the shirt. Well, where did you go after you left Moselle? He said, Alameda. And Now, I'm talking about leaving Moselle. I'm talking about that morning after the murders. Where does he go? They go to Miss Libby's in Alameda, and Buster and his girlfriend and Alec rode together. He said John Marvin also spent the night there, but he wasn't sure if he rode in the car with them. So the next morning they got up, came back to Moselle. He wasn't sure what time they got up. They're looking at timelines, and he said it helps. He said off the top of my head it's difficult. He said they showered at Moselle, and Maggie's folks at that point were on their way to come to Moselle. So when SLED searched the house, he said, I knew they were doing it. I wasn't in the gun room. There's that video that shows some of the law partners in that gun room. He said, we made it available to them, told SLED they could do anything, anytime, any car they wanted. They had full control over whatever they wanted. And so he had talked to David Owens. He told him to get the GPS and the phone data because he wanted to prove where he was. Now, that's an investigator, by the way. He said, I knew our phones never crossed paths, and that was important to me that they take the phones and the GPS, and in his mind, thought would clear him. He's asked, did you know Maggie's passcode? Yes. To the computer? Yes. Did she know yours? Yes. So after the phone was located, he was the one that gave SLED the code to unlock it. Maggie had location services, and he talked about how she liked to use Find My Friends. Our family does that too, y'all. She loved to see Brooklyn, Papa, Grandma, Papa T, her sister, her nieces, etc., just to see where they were at any given time. So if she saw someone was at Walmart, she would text them, "Hey, bring me a TV from Walmart." And so he knew there would be GPS on her phone because he knew she used that service a lot. So why is it important to get the data? He said, I knew since I found Paul and Maggie, I would be the suspect. And he believes the information they would have found on the phones and the GPS would show it couldn't have been him that did this. So they talk about the GPS not being on Maggie's phone. It switched over to June 9th. We've heard testimony had it been in the bag that is made for phones that they don't want any data coming to or going from, they might have had that June 6th. So he said a lot of people came over to support him that next day. He said it was a lot of people. Then he's asked, were you alone the rest of that week? And Alec said, I was attached to Buster at the hip. So we know on June 11th, his dad died. They go back to the day after the murders. He stayed with Buster and Brooklyn at John Marvin's in Greenfield. And he said, as the crow flies, it's less than 5 minutes. So they stayed there all week through that Sunday. Maggie and Paul's funeral, this was a little confusing to me. He said Saturday. I've heard it was Saturday. He said their funeral was Friday. Dad's was Sunday. And at his funeral, he said, I forgot the term. They weren't ready yet, meaning I don't think Maggie and Paul's bodies were ready to be buried. I could have swore at their graveside I saw 2 boxes that had ashes in it, but I don't know. I wasn't there. So the next week on that Monday, he went to Grandma and Papa T's in Somerville, which is not far from here. I think like 40 minutes. He thinks he drove alone, but he can't remember. He stayed with them Monday through Wednesday, and then he went up to Greenville to see his niece. He said Maggie was super excited and proud of her nieces. The baby being born was a big deal to Alec. He said it was a beautiful baby girl, beautiful mom. He said he actually went to Lake Kiwi. I say Greenville, but it's about 30 minutes away from the city. The baby was born after they got there on Thursday, but they couldn't see it until Saturday. So on June 16th, that was a Wednesday, they stay in Somerville. Then he asked, did you take a tarp to your mom's? Nope. Blue rain jacket. Never saw it, never touched it. Our next partner is Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens literally every day. I gave AG1 a try because I'm always busy and my diet isn't the best, but I still want to get all the vitamins my body needs without taking a ton of pills. I take AG1 in the morning before my first cup of coffee, and it makes me feel ready to take on my day. Why take a bunch of different things when you can just mix 1 scoop of powder in water once a day? It's the healthiest thing you can do in under a minute. With 1 scoop, I'm getting 75 vitamins and minerals that help my mood, energy levels, and healthier hair, skin, and nails. It's delivered to me every month, and it's been the easiest way to arm my body with everything it needs to tackle my day. If you're looking for an easier way to take supplements, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/whattheworld. That's athleticgreens.com/whattheworld. Check it out. He said he don't remember the tarp. He said maybe at some point, but it wasn't any time around his dad's funeral or weeks following. Asked when he went to work, 8:30, 9:30. He's asked, is that correct? He said, no, actually, it was a little bit after noon. And then he says that he has a key card to get in his office and it creates a digital footprint like your phone, like your car, whatever. He told them they could check the log and see when he went in his office. And the defense points out he offered information anytime that he wasn't sure. He would tell them, you can take my phone, you can do whatever. He talked to Shelley Smith, as we know, about how long you were there. Alex said, I told her Sleb was going to come talk and she needed to tell the truth. That's not what Miss Shelley testified to. Miss Shelley said, if they ask, I was here 30 to 40 minutes. So after the boat crash, he talks about social media, papers. It went deeper. He said there was so much talk about he had fixed witnesses and structured the investigation, which he says wasn't true. Alec requested some information, and he said he had been begging David Owens to meet, and specifically, and he pauses, and he said, I wanted Grandma and Papa T to meet with me and them, and they had questions that I didn't know the answer to. So he thought that August 11th meeting was just an update status of the investigation. They let Alec know he's the prime suspect. Alex said, yeah, you hear how I'm in the circle, and he couldn't get me out, the circle of suspects. So they talk about the August 11th meeting where they show him the Snap chat. He doesn't remember if they showed him a video or a picture. This is where he put something in there. And he said the clothes weren't an issue until they figured out there was no blood spatter on me. In other words, what he was wearing in that Snapchat video was never an issue until they realized there was no blood spatter on that t-shirt that he was wearing that Sled took. He said the blood spatter, it was a lie. All of a sudden, the clothes I was wearing in that Snap video became an issue in the week. And he said just in the weeks leading up to trial. And he said he kept clothes everywhere like Paul and kind of after the murders and stayed everywhere. He never slept at Moselle again like we know, and he pauses and just said he couldn't. When they got back from Greenville, he stayed with Maggie's parents, Randy, John Marvin. He said Buster and I stayed at Edisto some, but in the beginning it was with his brothers. And Buster had a job, and he said that his place of employment, Alex said that Buster's place of employment had been so kind to him. They had given him a lot of time off, but he had to go back to work. And so he'd stay at John Marvin's. And he said that he just had his clothes spread out everywhere, kind of like Paul did. So they get to, he was making some serious eye contact with the jury, by the way. I have that in my notes here, but they go into talking about Gene Seckinger and the Ferris fees. So Jeannie told him she was following up on that, and he said she was doing her job and following up on that. He couldn't remember what he told her that day, and the conversation was interrupted. So he just told her, it's in Chris Wilson's account. Don't worry about it. There was some level of concern when she confronted him, but he said it wasn't huge. And he said Annette sent Chris Wilson an email, and Chris Wilson called Alec back. And he wasn't worried about Chris Wilson having to open his books to show that money. He said, we were close that Chris Wilson's partner had split with the firm, and his partner was divorcing him. So the wife of that partner tried to get the financials for that case specifically, I guess, to see if maybe he was getting fees he wasn't accounting for in the divorce, because future ex-wives don't play that game. So he knew he wouldn't send, the dues anytime soon, and he knew he'd have to deal with it, but there was no immediate urgency. Now, then he learned that Randolph was going back to the hospital because he was having breathing issues. It was a worst case scenario of what happened, the worst case being an obstruction from the cancer that he had. Initially, the doctor thought it was pneumonia, and for a brief while, the prognosis looked better than what it actually was, and it didn't stay good for very long, is what he said. So Miss Eckinger just stopped the conversation when she learned that Randolph was terminal. And then the next day was when they find out he is terminal. So they talk about, did you think on June 7th your house of cards was crumbling? And he said, absolutely not. They talk about him reaching out to Russell Laffitte, the president of Palmetto State Bank, who now has been found guilty and sentenced to, it's like 30 years in prison. But he talked to Russell Laffitte about extending the loan on Moselle. He had equity in Moselle, and that was fully in Maggie's name. So they owed $1,800,000 on it, but it had appraised at $3.3 million. So 1,700 acres, you have timber value, which is, he said, let's just say $1,000 an acre. That raises your appraisal. So on top of Moselle, they had equity in the Edisto house. They owed $250,000 on that. It appraised around just under $1 million. So the equity in Edisto was $700,000. So Maggie's death actually made it more difficult to obtain financing because Moselle was solely in her name. Edisto, half her name, half his. So Maggie didn't question finances either. And he said after the murders, she wasn't there and there were estate issues. So they talk about the hearing that was set for June the 10th for that boat crash. If you remember, they had that meeting and that was part of kind of fitting the motive. But his level of concern was focused really about a change of venue. That motion, that was what he was most focused on, not the financials. So he said that the Beach family filed in Hampton County. Parker's, which is the convenience store that sold Paul the alcohol the night of the fatal boat crash, they wanted to move that to Beaufort. Now, Alec, of course, wanted that in Hampton. I think it would have swayed his way, y'all. What do you think? He said, but at that point, I'm a party. I'm not the lawyer on that case. So he let his lawyer's lawyer. He said, did what I had to do for that financial statement. And he wasn't worried about his finances coming out because he said, I'm a civil attorney. You know, he does this. These are the kind of cases that he tries. This is his bread and butter, cases just like the one he's named in. And he said in 27 years of plaintiffs trying to get financials, he's never been able to get a single judge to order more than a net worth statement until you're much closer to trial. So to him, he was working on those assets and liabilities, which is what Mark Ball found in his office. He just testified about that yesterday, finding the assets and then finding the debts. He said because of the charges to Paul, he had to keep things close. And he said he wrote it in his best handwriting because another paralegal, not his own, would be typing it up. And that would have been used that Thursday, if anything, as far as the financials. And so Jim Griffin's like, did you steal client money? I did. Ferris case? Yep. And then he's asked, how did you get in this financial predicament? And he said, I'm not sure. He said he battled addiction. He was buying pills, OxyContin. He said it first started, he played college football at South Carolina. He hurt his knee and the surgery didn't work. So within 2 years, he had a lot of knee trouble and he had 2 surgeries. And the last one that he had was in 2002, 2004. He wasn't sure. He started taking hydrocodone, which is Lortab. He got addicted very quickly and took that a while. And then he would wean off and go back, just that cycle. So he moved on to oxycodone around 2008, 2009. And he said it just escalated. He said he had been to detox 3 times. The first was in December of 2017. And he said before then, he tried to detox everywhere. He said anywhere he could try to detox, he would. And Maggie would help him. So he talks about the 3 detox sessions. All were in Sunrise Detox in Atlanta. He says a good facility. So remember, he was in detox on that sled conference where he admitted to the roadside shooting, by the way. He said 7 days is standard for opioid detox. He explains what detox is. It's getting the drugs out of your system. No physical dependency. It becomes mental. So he talks about how the withdrawal is very hard. You vomit, you have diarrhea, you sweat, you can't hold your legs still. He said that goes away after about 24 hours, then you can maybe sleep. Rehab is different from detox. Detox is getting it out of your system. Rehab is learning how to stay off. Before the roadside shooting incident and September of 21, he had never actually went to rehab. So after detox in 2017, it didn't take him long to relapse. And he said it's been a battle as long as he can remember. So then he says he's 535 days clean, and he's very proud of that. So Labor Day weekend, he was confronted by the firm for stealing and misconduct. Law partners, he said they were not aware of his addiction. And he said it was extremely bad, but he was able to function. We know Alec was forced to resign. And the roadside shooting, September 4th, he said he woke up, met Chris Wilson and his mom at Alameda. He just laid it all out for him, the addiction, the stealing of the money. He said, although he did not tell him all of it. And he said he had already contacted the detox facility that day, and he was set to go on Monday. So he had asked Blanca for the insurance card. He said he asked her for that to use at detox that Monday. And he wanted to go that day to eat with Corey Fleming. So he had given his pills to Randy, and he said he took a lot that day because he knew detox was coming up. He couldn't get some the night before. He said, I could tell I wasn't taking near what I had. So he called someone, being Eddie Smith, to bring more pills before he met Chris Wilson. He said, I don't know if he brought more pills or not. He said, when I met with him, I changed my plan, not to get pills, but I asked him to shoot me. And Jim Griffin says, why? For sympathy? And he said, no, so I'd be gone. And he said, who did you ask to shoot you? He said, Eddie Smith. When asked, did he shoot you? He said, he did. Y'all, you don't need enemies when you got friends like Eddie Smith. Shoot you in the head. So they talk about it being on Salkehatchie Road. He said he knew all of this was coming to a head. It would be hard for Buster. And he said, I'd been through so much, losing Paul and Maggie. He was in a bad place. And he said, I don't think that way now. Thank goodness. So the life insurance, Maggie was actually the beneficiary on that, but it was for $12 million. And he added he never had life insurance on Maggie or Paul. So he asked Alec to tell him about Maggie. He started sobbing. He said she was as beautiful inside as she was outside. So adventurous. You could tell her something was good or bad, but that wasn't good enough. She wanted to go find out for herself. She was devoted, fun, playful, and she had the kind of laugh that you didn't have to know what was said that was funny, but if she laughed, you did too. He said she would give a playful look, smile, and bite her lip. He said it would melt you. She was such a lady, feminine, but with two boys, she became a boy's mom. She was riding four-wheelers. And he said, don't get me wrong, she was girly, but she threw herself into that role of being a boy mom. And he said she didn't work, but she worked. And that was taking care of us. He talked about how the pregnancies with Buster and Paul were hard on her. They actually wanted a bigger family, but he said she was sick all the time. He would leave in the morning, she was sick. He would get home, she was sick. And he said, I think that made her love her boys more, how hard those pregnancies were. He said she'd put on an elegant ball gown and go to the governor's mansion, or she could go some random place in Walterboro, and she was the same. He said she was a special person, and he said, I'd never hurt Maggie ever. So with Paul, he said he was bright, inquisitive. And he said if you were in the shop or doing some work as a kid, his little head would come in and see what you were doing. He said he was a country boy. He was tough. He could do anything. Took care of so many things. On the other hand, he had a sweet side. He'd come home and check on his grandparents, both sets of grandparents in Somerville and Alameda. He said he was tender. He would get all of his buddies on a boat and watch the sunset. That might not have been the best thing to bring up, though. I'm just saying, and I'm not making a funny, but there was some motion in the courtroom, and I'm sure he didn't mean that as a slight, but it wasn't the best analogy to talk about in that context. He cared about people. He was fiercely loyal. He said he was just misrepresented in the media. And he said, I challenge any of you to go find someone who knew Paul, with somebody who has good intentions towards Paul even now, to say anything negative about him. I mean, he said, I encourage all of you. Mark Ball said Paul hadn't found his place yet. And Alex said he was ADHD, jumped around a lot. He said he would have found that one thing and he would have been the best at it. He said, I didn't know this when Paul was alive. He had told his friends, be present, appreciate where you are and the things you have and the people around you. He said, be present. He was 22 years old. So Jim Griffin said, did you love Paul? He said, I loved him. And he said, I love him and Buster more than anything. Love Maggie from the first date. I would never hurt them. So Cross, Creighton Waters is a great prosecutor. I think it's just too much on the financials, y'all. We're here for double murder, and we're at the end of this trial. We have extended this trial financials. Let's not do it again tomorrow. 3 to 4 more hours on Cross, according to Waters. Then we've got redirect and then back and forth. So Creighton Waters starts off. Let's start with things we could agree on. Explain the lie. You weren't at the kennels. I mean, he says the first time law enforcement, the prosecution, every person that you talked to, you said you were not at the kennels. All this time later, this is the first time we've heard you say you weren't. Very powerful way to start that out, because really, I'm going to tell you right now, that is one of the biggest things I think is at the center of this with Alec. It's there. Little detective left one last clue. Dad was at the kennels. So I think that's the biggest issue. And Creighton Waters wasted no time saying, hey, why are we just now hearing this after all this time? So then he points out, you stole money from clients since 2010. Alex said it's a long time. And then Creighton talks about the family legacy in the legal profession. So the great grandpa, he was solicitor for the district that we're in right here. He died in 1940. He was solicitor for 20 years. His grandpa, Richard Murdaugh Jr., they called him Buster. They called it the old Buster. He was a solicitor for 46 years, 1940 to 1986, longest serving prosecutor in the country. And he said, I loved him dearly. His dad, Randolph, the solicitor, he picked up after grandpa retired, because after 72, you can't serve. He ran and became the chief prosecutor. That was 1986 to 2006. He was a fine man. Creighton Waters said, yes, he was. Creighton Waters, I think, had worked with Randolph at one point. So Creighton says your heritage is so ingrained and such a central part of the legal community. And so he asks about Alec's schooling. He went to law school, graduated in 94. He was never a full-time solicitor, and so he went into private practice, where the big bucks are, right? He's asked, were you a successful lawyer? Alex said, yeah. You won and settle cases? Yes. So he was president of the Trial Lawyers Association, and he said that was back in the 2015 range. And normally he would do all kinds of cases. He would handle big cases, small cases. He said, if somebody was charged $20 more than they should have for their cable to everything in between. He said car accidents were the biggest cases he's ever had. And then Mr. Waters points out, you investigate the facts of the case, you get data from cars. And he said, well, I've never had a case where I've used data like you guys have in this case. He said mainly it was the black box and the OnStar that he would get. He's relied on call logs, cell tower pings, all the relevant stuff. And he started with the firm in September of 1998. He said, by those criteria, yeah, I'm successful. But he said, y'all pointed out my flaws today, so I don't think I'm successful. And at the time, he said, I don't think people saw me as prominent. There was a lot of question about, do you think that your family is prominent? Do you think you were successful? There's a lot of time spent on that. They talk about law enforcement and the friendships and professionally, the relationships he had. He said, yeah, he did. And then just as a litigator, he said a lot of the cases were tractor trailer, cars, that kind of thing. He dealt with law enforcement a lot. He was a volunteer assistant solicitor at the law firm, and they would have events. They weren't sponsored for law enforcement, but they would invite them to come, of course. So he said, yeah, we had friends in law enforcement. So he became a prosecutor when he moved from Beaufort to Hampton in 98. Now, this badge was the source of some back and forth. He got a badge from his dad. So he had prosecuted cases like the one we're in now. In 1998 to 2021, he prosecuted prosecuted 5 jury trials, all of those with his dad. He wanted to be assistant solicitor mainly to spend time with his dad, according to him. But then Creighton Waters, you had 2 badges. And he said, well, when my dad died, I got his badge. Did you have cases plead out or be dismissed? And he said, I'm sure I took some pleas. I don't remember a case not going to trial. So then he moves on. You're the breadwinner for your family. And he said, absolutely. He said, I was the source of income for Maggie, Paul, and Buster. He said, Buster had a job, but I still provided. He has Alec open this badge, y'all, and it's Grandpa's badge. He said he didn't keep it in any particular place, but law enforcement found it in the Mercedes on the day of the roadside shooting. Alec said, I believe it. And he kept the other in his car. He would keep it in the dash, center console, the cup holder, front seat. Creighton Waters like, well, as on the dash is a face up or down. He said, just however I stored it. He said, on occasions, I would have it in the dash for a reason sometimes. So he said he would put it away if he was going somewhere he didn't want anybody to see it. He said, if I get pulled over, I put it in the cup holder so the officer could see it. Creighton Waters is like, why? Alex said, because law enforcement oftentimes will kind of chill out. They'll be friendlier and he said, when you're law enforcement. And Creighton Waters said, you thought you're law enforcement? He said, no. So you carried a badge for 2 decades. He said, yes. And he asked, do you use it to your advantage? And Alex said, yeah, in some circumstances, yes. If maybe he won't get a ticket. I mean, look, the dude's lied about so much. I'd have been like, nah, I'd never do that, dude. So then Creighton Water says, did you take an oath? And he said, I don't think I did. Creighton Water says, raise your hand. It's your duty to blah, 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 blah. And he said, if I did, it was informal and it would be on some paper, but he couldn't remember it. So then he shows Alec his ID, which is in that badge. And what office does it say? He has him read. It is the solicitor of the 14th Judicial Circuit as of July 1st, 2013. So he said, I was never a deputy solicitor. I was a volunteer solicitor. And that little thing that he had him read, signed by Duffy Stone, who was the old solicitor. So you were asking me if I took an oath. Then you started asking me about these things. So he reads what the back says. You were reading off what Duffy Stone gave me. The card on the bottom is what I got from Duffy. He said the one on top was what came from my dad when he was solicitor. And then he asks, was your car a government vehicle? He said, no. The prosecutor said, did you have blue lights? And he said, yes, that was in a law firm owned car. He had them installed by the guy who actually does the blue lights for the 14th Circuit, all the sheriffs and all that. So he says, blue lights in one car, December to January, 6 months. So he had just had this car for 6 months, the Suburban. The previous car, 5 years. He said, during that 5-year period, I had lights installed. He talks about the sheriffs, T.C. Smalls and Andy Strickland. He was friends with Andy. And so they show a picture of the Suburban. Then we go in the boat case. You say civil case. I think about charges brought against Paul. That's what his mind goes to, according to him, is not the civil case. It was the charges brought against Paul. So did you ever call Paul in recorded statements to law enforcement? Or is today the first day. And Alex says, "Is today the first day I called my son Paw Paw?" "No, sir." Creighton Waters is just like, "Yeah, but did you ever say Paw Paw when you talked to law enforcement before?" And he said, "I don't know if I did or not," which is interesting. He never did. He only did it today. And I mean, look, that could be a tactic of making it seem more fatherly to the jury. Who knows? I mean, they're lawyers, y'all. They're smart. They know what they're doing. I don't know though. Smart. It's kind of like, how do you think you're going to steal 10, $11 million and get away with it too? Most criminals, even if they're smart, aren't smart. So they ask about if he had his badge on the night of the boat wreck at the hospital. Alex says, "I don't know. I wasn't in an official capacity." So what does Creighton Waters do? He throws a big old picture up on the screen with that badge hanging out his pocket. "Why did you have it hanging out?" He said, "I don't remember." It's a little convenient, y'all, right? We know he's throwing weight around. If you've seen the HBO Max documentary, you see him go from room to room to room. And everybody on that video said he wasn't checking on the kids. Creighton said, "Did you want some advantage for it?" And Alex said, "I may have." "Well, what advantage is that?" He said, "If I wanted an advantage using that badge, I would say it definitely has a warming tactic with law enforcement. If you say I was getting advantage, then okay." That's one thing, y'all, all day. If Creighton Waters said something, instead of Alec kind of disputing it, he would just say, "Okay, I agree with that." Like, he really was avoiding the confrontation. I think at times it frustrated the prosecutor too that Alec wasn't engaging him, especially towards the end. I think Creighton's got it. I think he'll go hard and strong tomorrow. They talk about, did he ever want to be solicitor? And he said, prior to my dad retiring before 2006, he said, "I wanted to be solicitor, yeah, for a long time, but his dad retired and he was struggling and he couldn't do it." I think he said with pills, could have been bills, but I think it was pills. So at the time his dad retired, he was in his addiction and couldn't do it. I have here that we're almost an hour into Cross and there's no talk of the murders. This is the point where the jury gets a little restless. Not the whole jury. It kind of alternated between different jurors at times who got bored, really. So when he talks about being on pills and not being able to be solicitor, Creighton Waters points out, but for over 15 years, you were able to maintain a successful law firm. Creighton Waters says, "Do you remember talking to the kids?" And he said, "Yes." It comes talking to the kids at the hospital, by the way. Alex says, the badge was just hanging out. I'm not saying that I didn't have the badge. I just don't remember. He's saying he just don't remember that he took it. Yeah, you did, dude. Or is it just one of those things where if he knows why he had that badge hanging? That could be it. I think that might be it. He talked about Morgan from the boat crash having a bad hand injury and being upset about Mallory. He said, "I left and went to Connor's room." And he's asked, "Did you tell anyone not to cooperate with law enforcement?" And he said, "No, didn't tell them not to cooperate." So, were you told of the investigation into the investigation of that night? He says, yes. So, they're investigating how the boat crash was investigated, is what he's saying. He said he became aware in the spring of the murders. So I have here that jurors are not interested. Some jurors are not interested, and then I have my little boxes in their seats, but I'm not going to reveal that until after trial. I'm not even gonna, even after trial, I don't reveal jurors or anything about them because, it's not their choice to be involved in such a big case. So we'll respect all that. In fall of 2020, his friend Andy Strickland was indicted for hampering an investigation, by the way. So he wants to know when he started stealing. And he said, "I'm just not sure the first time." He said, "I've been in rehab and jail. I don't have access to financials to go through that." But he said, "I don't deny it, but I don't remember." He said the cause of the finances was addiction. It wasn't the only cause, but it was one of the causes. So Creighton Waters mentions that the real estate kind of went bad when the recession hit. And at the same time, his law partners thought with the scale of cases that he had coming in that he would be okay. Alec really just kind of was like, "I don't dispute it. I don't dispute it." Now, this is where we get into a case by case of the financials, which are horrific crimes in themselves. We've beat this horse, y'all. I'm not going to sit here for an hour and go through. But essentially, Creighton Waters had him list out, the Badger case. Unfortunately, that poor man was a quadriplegic. Recovery was over 10 million. Alec charged 4 million in legal fees. I'm not sure how that works. I've never sued anybody or I've never been sued, but I think the attorney fee is like 40%, so I haven't done the math. But Creighton says something. In the end, that $4 million attorney fees wasn't enough. Alex says, no, I took monies that weren't mine. He said he had problems while this was going on because Creighton asked if he had land deals that went bad, and he just said he had problems. Creighton also mentions, maybe some of this too was an extravagant lifestyle. And Alex said, probably. He says at the time, 2011 ish, were you making more than $1 million a year and you still stole? Alex, yes. He said, what do you mean? Alex said, I spent money that wasn't mine. I shouldn't have done it. And then Creighton Waters, will you concede that not all that money went towards pills? And Alex says, yeah, I'll concede that. He said, I was making a bunch of money, should have had more money than I did. He said, I don't dispute that I spent a lot of money, most of which probably wasn't his. So I have 8 pages, y'all, of financial stuff that was gone over today. I don't know what you guys think, but I'll tell you this. Alec tried his hardest to get away from these financials. He would just say, yep, I agree. I did it. I stole from him. Became this back and forth. And Alec would pretty much say the same thing he did for like 2 hours. I, I did them wrong. I lied. I stole. I mean, it was kind of the same saying for all of it. I'm trying to go through my notes and find it. Oh, yeah. I don't dispute any of this. I took that money and I misled people. At one point, Creighton Water says, I know you want the answer to be simple. We agree on that. But Creighton's like, we're going to talk about it. So he also denied any conspiracy with Russell Laffitte and again said on the stand today that if Russell Laffitte broke the law, he did so not knowing what was really up. Now, Laffitte's been tried and convicted in federal court. So, anyways, that's just, and again, this is going to far reach because you look at like the children in Russell Laffitte's life, they're going to be affected. That guy's going to be gone 20, 30 years. I forget how much he got. You just see it's like a snowball downhill, and so many people are affected. When it all came down to, it was never enough money for Alec. And I still don't buy that it was pills for all that money. It's somewhere. PVC pipe, Uncle Eddie's backyard. Y'all ain't checked yet, have you? So they just go through all these financial. I lied. I stole. I was wrong. He said that. At one point, I felt like Creighton Waters was getting a little frustrated that Alec wasn't getting frustrated or that yeah, I mean, it really kind of seemed that way. And I had somebody lean into me from behind me and say, I hope he doesn't lose his temper because it's not going to look good. I really don't think he was even close today, though. He really kept his composure. This cross exam right now is a marathon and not a sprint. So we've pounded in these jurors' brains. No moral compass, no heart. Does those that he's the closest to very wrong. Chris Wilson. I think that could be something big for the jury. However, I do think they're tired of the financials. Maybe tomorrow more fireworks. We shall see. But I'm just going to wrap it up there. We're over an hour. It really was just all financials. They're still cross with Mr. Waters tomorrow. He made clear today, nowhere near done. So they will not be able to call their witnesses. The defense will not be able to call. They have a pathologist coming in. I've heard a blood spatter expert. So we will see. I'm not sure. Let's see, he did say the pathologist, and then he thought 2 hours total for those two witnesses. He really wanted to get them out of the way. Creighton did not want to mess up the flow of the cross. So as of now, back to Alec, first thing in the morning. Hope you guys have a good evening. I'm about to pack up. As soon as court is over tomorrow, I'm hitting the road. I'll be on News Nation maybe at 9. Hopefully I make it home in time. I'll keep you updated. Just got finished with News Nation a little while ago. Had a great time. I was on there very briefly, but it was fun. So guys, we'll bring it to you Saturday. So tomorrow's testimony most likely will be summed up on Saturday just because it's a travel day. I leave here, get caught up in traffic in Columbia, Finally get to Greenville, usually about 9. I have to be on News Nation at 9, so I might slip out a little early, but I doubt I'll have time to get everything ready for tomorrow night. So look for tomorrow's episode or tomorrow's testimony to be wrapped up first thing Saturday. All right, guys, we'll see you soon. Have a good one.